There are numbers that live in the memory of a nation, not because of their size, but because of the weight they carry, the weight of days, the weight of lives. For America, at the close of the 1970s, that number was 52. 52 souls trapped behind a wall 8,000 miles from home. And for every one of them, there was another number, a number that grew with every rising sun, a number that was chanted on the nightly news like a drumbeat of failure. Day 100, day 200, day 300. A clock that would not stop, marking not the passage of time but the endurance of a crisis that held an entire country in its grip. It was a slow-motion nightmare, played out in grainy television footage and the stark headlines of morning papers. A feeling of profound helplessness had settled over the land. Yellow ribbons, once a simple folk symbol for a loved one away at war, now bloomed on every tree, every lamppost, a silent, nationwide prayer for the return of the 52. They were diplomats, administrative staff, Marine Guards. They were faces the country came to know, their names recited like a solemn litany. They were not prisoners of war in the traditional sense. There was no declared war. They were hostages, pawns in a geopolitical game whose rules were being written day by agonizing day on the streets of a city few Americans could find on a map, Tehran. To understand the desperate gamble that would unfold in the dark of the Iranian desert, you must first understand the pressure building in the heart of the American government. You must understand the man who felt every tick of that clock more than anyone else on earth. President Jimmy Carter, a man of deep faith and a profound belief in diplomacy, found his presidency and his nation's pride chained to the fate of these 52 people. Every diplomatic channel was explored, every back-channel negotiation attempted. Sanctions were imposed, assets were frozen, allies were pleaded with. But the government in Iran, itself born of chaos and revolutionary fire, was not a conventional government. It did not respond to conventional pressure. The demands were simple and they were impossible. Return the deposed Shah, the king who had ruled Iran for nearly 4 decades, to face revolutionary justice. The story of how America and Iran arrived at this bitter impasse is a long and tangled one, a story of oil, of Cold War fear, and of unintended consequences. For decades, the United States had propped up the government of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. To Washington, he was a bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East, a modernizer, a stable source of oil in a volatile region. His military was armed with the latest American weaponry. His friendship was a cornerstone of American foreign policy. But to millions of his own people, the Shah was a tyrant. His secret police, the dreaded Savak, were infamous for their torture and repression. His program of westernization was seen by many devout Muslims as a corrupting poison, an assault on their culture and their faith. His immense wealth stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the villages and the sprawling slums of Tehran. In January of 1979, the dam of popular resentment finally broke. The Shah, weakened by dissent and ravaged by cancer, was forced to flee his own country. A revolution, decades in the making, swept the nation. And from exile in France returned a figure who had been a ghost in Iranian politics for 15 years. A stern, unyielding cleric with piercing eyes and a white beard, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He represented a total rejection of the Shah's world, and by extension a total rejection of the Shah's greatest patron, the United States, which he famously branded the Great Satan. For months, the new revolutionary government and the United States circled each other in a state of deep distrust. But the final, irrevocable break came in October of 1979. President Carter, against the stark warnings of many of his own advisors, but moved by humanitarian pleas, made a fateful decision. He agreed to allow the dying Shah to enter the United States for cancer treatment. In the fevered atmosphere of revolutionary Tehran, this act was not seen as one of mercy. It was seen as the ultimate betrayal. It was proof that America was still protecting the man they called a murderer and a thief. It ignited fears of a repeat of 1953, when a CIA-backed coup had overthrown a popular prime minister and restored the Shah to his throne. To the young radicalized students who saw themselves as the guardians of the revolution, it was a call to action. America was not just a foreign power, It was the puppeteer, and now it was sheltering its puppet. On November 4th, 1979, a day that would forever alter the relationship between the two countries, a large group of these students, calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, descended upon the sprawling US Embassy compound in the heart of Tehran. They cut the locks on the gates and scaled the walls. The small contingent of Marine Guards inside, under strict orders to avoid bloodshed, were quickly overwhelmed. They fired tear gas, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. The students poured in. Inside the embassy, a frantic scene unfolded. Staff rushed to shred sensitive documents, smashing communications equipment with hammers. They believed this would be a temporary occupation, a symbolic protest that would last a few hours, maybe a day. They had no idea they were at the beginning of a journey into a dark and uncertain captivity that would last for 444 days. Initially, the takeover was not an official act of the Iranian government, but the Ayatollah Khomeini quickly saw its power. The raw anti-American energy it unleashed was a potent tool for consolidating his own authority over the more moderate factions within the government. He gave the takeover his blessing, praising the students as heroes. The embassy was declared a den of spies, and the captured Americans became human shields, leverage against the might of the United States. The student protest had become a state-sanctioned act of terror. And so, the waiting began. Day after day, the news showed the same images: angry crowds chanting outside the embassy walls, blindfolded Americans being paraded for the cameras. The crisis consumed America. It led the nightly news every single night. Ted Koppel's famous program, America Held Hostage, began its long run, its title a constant reminder of the nation's impotence. For President Carter, the political cost was immense. The crisis paralyzed his administration, projecting an image of weakness that would haunt his campaign for re-election. He was a man caught in an impossible bind. A military strike on the embassy itself was unthinkable. The hostages would almost certainly be killed in the crossfire. But as the months dragged on, as winter turned to spring in 1980, and every diplomatic overture hit a stone wall, the military option, once a distant and dangerous last resort, began to look like the only resort. The pressure to do something, to act decisively and break the stalemate, was becoming unbearable. Somewhere in the quiet, secret corners of the Pentagon and at remote military bases, a plan began to take shape. It was a plan of breathtaking complexity and incredible risk. It would involve every branch of the US military. It would require flying hundreds of men and a fleet of aircraft undetected across a hostile country. It was a roll of the dice on a scale that had rarely been attempted. It was a plan that relied on perfect timing, perfect execution, and perfect weather. It was a desperate answer to a desperate problem. The plan was given a code name, a name that evoked strength, pride, and the promise of a swift, sharp strike from the heavens. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. Operation Eagle Claw was, at its core, an engineering problem. It was a question of physics, of fuel burn rates, of payload capacity, and of time. Before a single shot could be fired, before a single member of Delta Force could set foot in Tehran, a gargantuan logistical bridge had to be built, stretched invisibly across 600 miles of hostile territory, used for a few critical hours, and then vanished without a trace. The plan's complexity was not a feature, it was a vulnerability. It was a brittle, intricate lattice of dependencies, where the failure of a single $10 gasket could doom a multi-million-dollar mission and the lives of more than 50 American hostages. The entire operation hinged on a desolate salt flat deep inside south-central Iran, a place the planners designated with the sterile functional name Desert One. This was the linchpin. It was here that the two main elements of the force, arriving from opposite directions, would meet in the dead of night to perform a maneuver that had never been attempted under operational conditions. From the east, flying from a staging base in Oman, would come the fixed-wing aircraft. This wasn't a small air group. It was a fleet of 6 massive C-130 Hercules transports. 3 of them were MC-130 combat Talons, the special operations variant, packed to the absolute limit of their takeoff weight. Inside their cavernous fuselages were the men, 93 Delta Force operators and a 13-man Special Forces team designated to handle the assault on the Foreign Ministry. They also carried the equipment, Humvees, motorcycles for reconnaissance, ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, and even Farsi-speaking interpreters. Every square inch of cargo space was meticulously allocated. The human cost of this logistics was measured in calories and water. Each operator was provisioned for a 48-hour mission cycle with a minimum of 5,000 calories of high-density rations and 2 gallons of water, a critical buffer against the debilitating effects of desert heat and combat stress. The other 3 C-130s were KC-130 tankers. Their mission was perhaps the most critical of all. They were, in effect, flying gas stations, but they wouldn't be refueling other planes in the air. Their cargo holds were filled with enormous custom-made rubber fuel bladders. Together, these 3 aircraft carried a staggering 18,000 gallons of JP-5 jet fuel. That's more than 60 tons of highly volatile liquid, a mobile pipeline that had to be landed on an unpaved, unlit and unsecured patch of desert. This fuel was the lifeblood of the operation. It was intended for the second element of the force, the one that made the entire plan so precarious. The helicopters, flying from the west, launching from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz steaming in the Gulf of Oman, were 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters. The choice of the Sea Stallion was itself a profound compromise, the first of many that would haunt the mission. The RH-53D was not a special operations helicopter. It was a naval minesweeping aircraft, designed to tow heavy sleds through the water to detonate sea mines. They were powerful, with the heavy lift capacity needed for the mission, and they were the only helicopters in the American arsenal that could be refolded to fit on an aircraft carrier's deck, and also possessed something close to the required range. But they were also notoriously maintenance-intensive. On the decks of the Nimitz, they were known as hangar queens, often requiring many hours of maintenance for every single hour of flight. Their complex hydraulic and electrical systems were not designed for long, low-level flights through fine, abrasive desert dust. And their navigation systems were rudimentary, relying on gyroscopes and Doppler radar, a far cry from the sophisticated terrain-following systems of the C-130s. The mission demanded that 8 of these temperamental machines launch into the darkness, fly for over 5 hours below enemy radar, and arrive at a precise point in a vast, featureless desert. The plan called for a minimum of 6 helicopters to successfully complete the mission. 8 were sent to provide a margin for error. At Desert 1, the plan called for a symphony of controlled chaos. The MC-130s would land first, their crews using infrared landing lights visible only through special goggles. The Delta operators would disembark and establish a security perimeter around the landing zone. Then, the KC-130 tankers would land. Ground crews would immediately begin unreeling massive fuel hoses from the bladders inside the planes. When the 8 Sea Stallions arrived, they would land in a precise formation, shut down their engines to conserve fuel, and be swarmed by the refueling teams. The process of pumping 60 tons of fuel into 8 helicopters using portable ground-based equipment in total darkness was the mission's primary technical hurdle. Every coupling had to seal, every pump had to work, every hose had to be laid out without kinking. Once refueled and loaded with the Delta operators, the helicopters would lift off again, leaving the C-130s behind. They would fly another 260 miles to a second secret location, a remote mountain hideout codenamed Desert 2. There they would conceal themselves for an entire day, the crews and soldiers trying to rest while avoiding detection by any passing shepherds or Iranian patrols. The C-130s, their job at Desert 1 done, would fly back to their base in Oman, leaving the assault force completely isolated, a tiny island of American military power deep within Iran, their only way out resting on the mechanical integrity of 6 aging helicopters. The following night, the assault phase would begin. The helicopters would launch from Desert 2 and fly into the heart of Tehran. The plan was a split operation. One team would land directly inside the compound of the U.S. Embassy, neutralize the guards and free the hostages. A second team would simultaneously assault the Iranian Foreign Ministry building a few miles away, where 3 senior American diplomats were being held. Once the hostages were secured, the helicopters would ferry everyone, hostages and rescuers alike, to a nearby soccer stadium. This was yet another logistical node. From the stadium, they were to be moved to the Manzaria Air Base, a desert airfield south of the city which, in a separate part of the operation, was to be captured and secured by a force of US Army Rangers flown in on yet more C-130s. As a final piece of the interlocking puzzle, 2 massive C-141 Starlifter medical transports would land at the captured airfield to fly everyone to safety in Egypt. The Sea Stallion helicopters, their one-way mission complete, were to be destroyed on site. To provide fire support and to prevent any Iranian military interference during this complex extraction, AC-130 Spectre gunships would be orbiting high above Tehran, ready to unleash a devastating curtain of cannon fire. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a chain of dependencies forged from the best technology and the bravest men the United States could muster. On paper, it was a masterpiece of contingency planning and military engineering. But it was a plan with zero redundancy, no margin for the unpredictable. It assumed perfect weather. It assumed every machine would function flawlessly. It assumed that a complex multi-stage refueling operation could be conducted on a hostile beachhead established just hours before. The entire massive weight of American prestige and the lives of 53 hostages rested on the hydraulics of a mine-sweeping helicopter, the seal on a fuel hose, and the whims of a desert wind. It was a chain forged in desperation, and it was about to be tested by the unforgiving reality of the Iranian night. The unforgiving reality of the Iranian night began not with a bang, but with the deafening rhythmic whoomp 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 of 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters lifting off the deck of the USS Nimitz. Inside, crammed into the cold, vibrating metal bellies of these machines, were the men of Delta Force and the US Army Rangers. They were the tip of the spear, the finest warriors America had, and they were flying into the unknown. For these men, the mission was already a war of attrition against their own bodies. The flight was long, over 600 miles, flown at dangerously low altitudes to avoid Iranian radar. The helicopters, designed for mine-sweeping over the ocean, were not insulated for the high-altitude desert. A deep, biting cold seeped through their flight suits and settled in their bones, a chill that no amount of adrenaline could completely ward off. They sat in near total darkness, shoulder to shoulder, weighed down by weapons, ammunition, and the crushing gravity of their task. There was no conversation over the shriek of the engines, only the shared, silent tension of men heading toward a destiny they could not predict. Then came the dust. It wasn't a storm in the way one might imagine, a towering wall of sand seen from a distance. It was insidious. First, a haze on the horizon, then a sudden enveloping cloud of fine silt, a meteorological phenomenon the locals called a haboob. For the pilots, flying on night vision goggles that amplified ambient light, the world dissolved. The goggles turned the swirling dust into a terrifying, milky blindness. The horizon, the ground, their wingmen, all vanished into a green phosphorescent chaos. They were flying by instrument and instinct alone, each man isolated in his own bubble of roaring engines and vibrating controls, praying the machine in front of him hadn't slowed, that the one behind him hadn't drifted. Sand finer than flour was ingested by the engines, scoured the plexiglass windscreens, and worked its way through every seal and crevice, a gritty, unwelcome passenger on a journey already fraught with peril. It was inside this swirling vortex that the chain began to break. The crew of Helicopter 6 saw the warning light first, a catastrophic failure in a main rotor blade. The blade hadn't broken off, but a sensor warned that it could at any moment, a failure that would turn their 7-ton machine into a plummeting coffin. Their pilot, his voice strained over the radio, made the call. They were turning back. One link was gone. On the USS Nimitz, the news was received with a grim tightening of the gut. The mission could still proceed with 7 helicopters. It was tight, but possible. Not long after, the crew of Helicopter 5 flew into a pocket of the haboob so dense, it triggered a severe case of vertigo in the pilot. The world outside his cockpit ceased to exist, replaced by a nauseating dance of glowing dials. His inner ear told him he was in a banking turn, while his instruments insisted he was flying straight and level. It was a fight against his own senses, a primal battle for control in a world without up or down. His co-pilot took the controls, but the damage was done. Disoriented and with failing flight instruments, they too made the agonizing decision to abandon the mission and return to the Nimitz. Now, only 6 helicopters were pressing on toward the rendezvous point, the salt flat designated Desert 1. The mission plan had called for a minimum of 6 helicopters to successfully assault Tehran. The margin for error had just been reduced to absolute zero. When Colonel Charlie Beckwith and his Delta Force team landed at Desert 1 aboard their C-130s, the first thing that hit them was the silence and the cold. The aircraft engines spooled down, and a vast, empty stillness descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind across the salt flat. They were deep inside enemy territory, an island of American military power in a sea of hostility. But they felt less like a powerful force and more like castaways. The 6 remaining sea stallions landed shortly after, emerging from the darkness like great wounded birds. The men who spilled out were shivering, their faces caked with dust, their eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and the strain of the flight. The news of the 2 aborted helicopters spread like a virus through the ranks. Hope began to curdle into a grim, mathematical certainty. Then came the final, fatal blow. As the helicopters were being refueled from the bladders inside the C-130 tankers, the crew of Helicopter 2 reported a complete hydraulic system failure. A pool of vital fluid was spreading beneath its fuselage, glistening in the faint light. Without hydraulics, the helicopter was an immovable, 20-ton lump of metal. It could not be flown, it could not be fixed. Beckwith stood on the salt-crusted earth, the commander of the most elite fighting force in the world, and understood that his mission was over before it had even begun. He had 5 operational helicopters. He needed 6. There weren't enough seats to carry his assault teams and the 53 hostages out of Tehran. The chain had shattered. After a tense series of satellite communications with the White House, the order came back: abort. The feeling at Desert 1 was not one of relief, but of profound soul-crushing failure. They had come so far, endured so much, only to be defeated by mechanical gremlins and a cloud of dust. But the human cost was yet to be paid in blood. The withdrawal was rushed, a frantic effort to get men and machines out of Iran before the sun rose and exposed them. In the chaotic shuffle of aircraft, a sea stallion, its rotors turning, lifted slightly to reposition. The pilot, blinded by the rotor wash kicking up yet more sand and dust, lost his spatial awareness. The massive helicopter drifted sideways, its main rotor blade slicing into the fuselage of the C-130 it had just been refueling. For a split second, there was a terrible grinding sound, a shriek of tortured metal. Then a soundless flash, then a concussive roar that rolled across the desert floor. The C-130, loaded with thousands of gallons of jet fuel and a crew of Air Force personnel, erupted in a blossoming fireball that lit up the Iranian night like a second sun. Inside the transport, men were instantly incinerated. Others, engulfed in flames, tried to escape the inferno. The Delta operators, who seconds before had been boarding another C-130, were thrown to the ground by the blast. Their immediate instinct was to run towards the fire, towards the screams. They saw their comrades, men they had trained with for months, transformed into living torches, stumbling out of the wreckage. The heat was unimaginable, a physical wall that seared the lungs. Ammunition inside the burning C-130 began to cook off, sending rounds zinging through the air in every direction. It was a vision of hell, a tangled mass of burning wreckage, the smell of superheated metal and cooking jet fuel, and the horrifying, unforgettable sound of men dying. Medics rushed forward, trying to treat horrific burns with nothing but the small kits on their belts. Colonel Beckwith and the other commanders screamed orders, trying to restore a semblance of control in a situation that had devolved into pure, primal survival. The priority was now simple: get everyone else out alive. The most terrible order a commander can give was then passed down the line. Get on the planes, leave them. They had to abandon the helicopters, now silhouetted against the raging fire. And worse, they had to leave the bodies of their fallen comrades inside the burning C-130. There was no time to recover them. To stay any longer was to risk the entire force being captured or killed at dawn. It was a violation of their deepest ethos: leave no man behind, a wound that for many would never fully heal. The operators, their faces blackened with soot, their hearts heavy with grief and failure, clambered aboard the remaining C-130s. As the transports clawed their way into the sky, the men looked back through the small windows at the funeral pyre they were leaving on the desert floor. The fire burned brightly, a solitary, defiant beacon of a catastrophe. They were not carrying hostages. They were carrying ghosts. 8 of them. 5 from the Air Force, 3 from the Marines. The mission to save 53 lives had just cost 8 of their own, and the longest night of their lives was far from over. The flight away from Desert One was a journey through a vacuum. The roaring violence of the fire and the screams of the dying were replaced by the monotonous, soul-numbing drone of the C-130's 4 engines. Inside, there was no conversation. There were no words that could fill the hollow space that had been carved into each man. They sat on the webbing seats, their state-of-the-art gear caked in sand and soot, their faces streaked with grime and tears they didn't know they had shed. They were the most elite fighting force America could produce, yet they felt like broken children, fleeing a nightmare of their own making. Each man was an island of shock, staring at the floor, at the bulkhead, at anything but the eyes of the man next to him. To look at another was to see your own failure, your own grief, reflected back. The ghosts they carried were not quiet. They were the faces of the crew of Repo 44, the Marine pilots of the helicopters, men they had shared meals with just hours before. The mission plan, a document of crisp, confident pages, was now just ash, blowing across a desert half a world away. As the sun rose over the Persian Gulf, the C-130s landed at a forward airbase in Oman. The men disembarked, stepping from the pressurized silence of the cabin into the humid morning air. They moved like automatons. Medics tended to the burned and injured, but the deepest wounds were invisible. The debriefings began almost immediately, a sterile, bureaucratic process that felt obscene after the raw horror of the night. Men accustomed to action and clear objectives were now forced to recount, step by agonizing step, how everything had unraveled, how the sand, the fine, seemingly insignificant dust of the earth, had defeated a superpower, how a simple turn by a helicopter, a routine refueling, had cascaded into a national catastrophe. Back in Washington, a president, aged by a single night, had to face his nation and the world. Jimmy Carter, a man of deep faith and meticulous planning, went on television to announce the failure. He took full responsibility. There was no one else to blame. The news hit America like a physical blow. The hope that had flickered for the 53 hostages was extinguished, replaced by a profound sense of humiliation and impotence. In Tehran, the Ayatollah's regime declared it a miracle, a divine intervention that had protected Iran from the great Satan. They paraded reporters and television crews out to the wreckage at Desert One. The world saw the images, the blackened skeletal remains of the C-130 and the RH-53D helicopter fused together in their death embrace. And they saw the other 5 sea stallions, sitting intact but abandoned, like great silent monuments to American failure. They became props in a global propaganda victory, their secret technology dissected, their presence a symbol of a giant brought to its knees. But the desert does not forget. Long after the television crews left and the wreckage was hauled away, the land held the memory. The Dasht-e-Kavir, the great salt desert, had been a silent witness. It had felt the weight of the aircraft, tasted the atomized fuel, and absorbed the blood of the fallen. For years, the spot was marked by a deep, dark scar on the pale earth, a place where the heat of the fire had vitrified the sand into glass. The winds that swept across that desolate plain carried more than dust. They carried the whispers of what happened there, of the collision of technology and fate, of meticulous plans and sheer, dumb luck. The land itself became the final silent tombstone for the mission. It held the story not in words, but in scorched earth and the lingering taste of metal on the wind, a permanent record of a night when men learned the hard lesson that some voids cannot be crossed, no matter how powerful the machine or how brave the heart. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw was not a failure of courage. The men who flew and fought and died that night were among the bravest the nation had. It was a failure of imagination, a failure of integration. It was a logistical turning point born from catastrophe. The post-mortem was brutal and necessary. It revealed a military where the branches barely spoke the same language. The Army helicopter pilots couldn't talk directly to the Air Force transport crews. The Navy helicopters weren't built for the fine, abrasive sand of a desert environment they had never trained in. The chain of command was a convoluted web stretching from the White House to a commander on the ground. With too many links, too many points of potential failure. There was no single entity, no unified command, responsible for America's most sensitive missions. From these ashes, something new was forged. The hard, painful lessons learned in the fire at Desert One led directly to the most significant reorganization of the U.S. military in a generation. A new command was born, the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, a dedicated headquarters to run these kinds of high-stakes missions. And later, the United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, was created, uniting all the special forces from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines under one roof. The ghosts of Desert One demanded it. The 8 men who died did not die in vain. Their sacrifice became the foundation stone for the modern American Special Operations Forces that would go on to perform legendary feats in the decades to come. Every successful raid, every hostage rescued in the years that followed, carries with it an echo of the failure in the Iranian desert. In the end, the hostages were not rescued by force. They were freed 444 days after their capture, on the very day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, released through the slow, grinding work of diplomacy. For the men of Operation Eagle Claw, this peaceful resolution was a bittersweet epilogue. Their mission, the one they had bled for, had become a footnote. The scars remained. They remained on the desert floor, a fading memory now, slowly being reclaimed by the sand. They remained on the national psyche, a reminder of the limits of power. And most of all, they remained on the souls of the men who were there. They carried the weight of their fallen brothers, the sting of abandoning them for the rest of their lives. Operation Eagle Claw is more than a story of military disaster. It is a story of how the smallest things, a grain of sand, a single hydraulic line, a moment of disorientation in the dark, can unravel the grandest of designs. It is a timeless, humbling lesson, whispered from a lonely patch of ground in Iran, that for all our planning and all our power, we are always and forever at the mercy of the unforgiving realities of the world.